Hey there, welcome to the Drawing Codex. In this video, I want to do a simple drawing lesson focusing on how to pose the character in different poses using the concepts of gesture and structure and a lot of the concepts that you might have seen, heard, or talked about in a book like Figure Drawing for All It's Worth by Andrew Loomis. This is where we basically perfect our ability to construct mannequins or stick figures that are heavily based on the skeleton and the basic structure of the human form. Now, the trick here is how do we pose that and get lots and lots of different angles and get the emotion and the character to sort of live through those little simple stick figures and mannequins. Obviously, the next step on from that is how do we sort of build the musculature on top. But what I want to focus on primarily in this video is a bunch of practical exercises that you can use to practice this idea of how we pose the mannequin, and I want to demonstrate how I do it and give you a few little tips and tricks that I guess adjust it and make it more fun. So let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome again to the Drawing Codex. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. If you want to learn more about line and color illustration and how to develop your own line and color style that you can use for comics or manga or bande dessinée, etc., you can check out my free quick start guide. It goes over my tips for how to create your own simple, reliable process in Photoshop for creating a very, very simple but reliable, as I said, which is super important, process in Photoshop. It talks about going from the thumbnail to the finished product and just how you control that and what sort of brushes I use, etc. It's free. The link will be in the description. So the idea here is pretty simple, hopefully. What we do is we basically get good at drawing stick figures. The stick figure, as I've often said, is really the easiest way to quickly pose the character. Now, the challenge with this is often that this can be a little bit academic, right? It can be a little bit boring. And so one of the things that I think you can use to make this more interesting to yourself, specifically if you are interested in creating, stylized comic book art that is has more interesting shapes, etc., or if you're trying to create gestures and postures that are much more dynamic, is really to try and suit this and make this fit your world. So I think you're always going to be more interested in actually applying the most important thing here, which is emotion, is physical emotion and acting. You're going to be better at applying that if you can actually get inside the type of world that you're trying to create. So it's really useful with all art education, but I think this one especially, to kind of make sure that you can emotionally relate to what's actually happening with the character. And that means basically imagining them as being an actual character and a character that you're interested in. And then what we want to do is imagine actual activities that might be useful to you as you draw that character. Now, this could be something where you pick a character that already exists if you want to do fan art, or if you have a character already designed that you kind of think about that and use this as an exercise there, or at least you go in with the intent of defining the type of character that we are drawing and the type of scenario that they would be, existing in. So you could imagine this as being, again, a fantasy character, which is something that always works for me. You could imagine a really basic idea. One could be a sort of highfalutin sort of elven character who's very sort of emotionally sort of reserved and sort of, upright and a little bit sort of, tense maybe. Again, going with generic fantasy tropes. The other you might have as like a burly dwarf. Now the question is, how do you pose them and make it interesting? The answer is that you have to feel and act out those emotions yourself. There's no real other way around it. You can't intellectualize your way around it. you can do well by thinking about how do people act, how do people pose, how do people sit. But at its core, you kind of have to, if you want to learn to draw fantasy stuff, you kind of have to get out your toy sword, you have to get out the broomstick and kind of feel what it's like to be in different postures and use that as a really, really easy way and a strong way to inject true emotion into your drawing. I think anyone who gets really good at this is, going to take a very similar route. You have to feel and act and emote through the drawing. And the best way to do that is to actually be able to role play and get a feel for what's going on there. If you talk about actors, right, they sort of say, what's my motivation? What am I doing in this scene? You can't just kind of walk onto a set and act as something without the thought process first. So part of this is having that thought process sorted, going in with that intent in the beginning so that you're not sort of unsure, well, who am I drawing and what am I drawing? And I think that can be one of the things that really sort of makes this tricky if you just go in it from like trying to just sort of replicate the kind of things that you would see in that kind of Andrew Loomis book, right? Because if that sort of stuff is not interesting to you, those kind of, classical sort of poses and things, right? Again, it can be good to get your feet, but to really make this apply to what you'll actually be doing, which is drawing cool stuff from your imagination. If you're listening to this channel anyway, hopefully that's what you're about. You have to think about what you're actually going to be using those skills for, which again is often drawing elves or dwarves or mechs or whatever crazy thing you can come up with from your imagination. Now, again, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a primer on where we're sort of going with it. We'll jump over to the drawing table now, and I'll show you kind of how I actually apply this, and I'll give you some tips for exercises you can do to, again, make this fun and sort of formalize it a bit, give yourself some structure. So let's jump in and go there now. All right, here we are at the drawing table. Now, before we get started with the actual drawing and demonstration, I want to go over a little bit of the theory in more detail so that hopefully when we talk about this, you understand where some of these concepts are fitting in. Now, as you can see, this is the Andrew Loomis Figure Drawing for All It's Worth book, which, again, I often just use as a good example of traditional, classical, constructive anatomy figure drawing, which, again, is just using the same tradition that has been used for hundreds of years of building and developing the figure. Now, this concept, I think, is really useful, and just this one page is immensely instructive. The basics of what we're sort of talking about here, I think, can be sort of summed up as sort of the first point or the first sort of stage or thing we're often trying to solve as we delve into this concept of posing characters. And that is just, how do we do the basics, right? So, how to do the basics. And a lot of that is just about sort of 3D space, or at least that's kind of how I'm defining it. And at this first stage, what you're sort of trying to do is solve the problem of, how do I kind of draw this figure, this mannequin, this stick thing in the first place, and how do I kind of make sure it looks okay in three-dimensional space? How do I just kind of pose it and get some level of control? So again, here you can see, I think these are some good exercises that you can do just from a traditional, normal how to draw book. You can figure out how to just draw a mannequin. Again, if you're not quite sure, this one is, perfectly fine to start. And what we're trying to do here is just control proportion. Make sure that you can draw it. Now, there's a lot of stuff that goes into this. There's a lot of structural drawing, perspective, general form drawing principles that you can use. As you begin this, the effectiveness of your ability to do this and all of these exercises is going to be affected by your ability to draw in general, your ability to think about the three-dimensional space, understand perspective, understand maybe some concepts of where a camera is, etc. So those are things I'm not covering in this video, and that's just sort of to be clear, because I think one of the questions that comes up is like, hey man, I don't really even understand how to do this, or like, this makes sense, but when I do it, my drawings suck. And it's like, sure, that's fine. I think it's still worthwhile playing around with this, even if you are sort of struggling to, just control those basic proportions. But again, there are a few sort of lessons and videos on the Drawing Codex channel currently, and there'll be a lot more in the future talking about some of those three-dimensional drawing concepts and just sort of general how to control perspective. But understand at the beginning, the major thing you're trying to do is just sort of draw a figure and make it feel as if, look, they're kind of there, right? They're sort of posed and it's looking okay. The second thing that I think, that you want to try and do is sort of think about how to add motion or emotion, right? So this is often what we're actually trying to do, is add emotion or just sort of motion. And this is just about what you would kind of see here, right, in this sort of second layer of drawings. Or we could kind of see some of them here. And this really is about taking this concept, but then being able to manipulate and move the mannequin so that we can sort of put it in some poses that feel like the character's alive, the character's doing something, right? The character is acting and it has some form of, character, right? For a lack of a better word. And I think this is also really important. Now, this is going to be affected by your just general ability to draw as well. The third thing that I think people are often sort of asking is like, I want to draw cool poses, right? So I think often, and again, I like to break these things down because I feel like intent is so important with drawing. It's one of the major sort of landmarks that I really try and hit. It's one of the key concepts of the Drawing Codex sort of ethos in general, is that intent is really, really important when you're going into doing any of this drawing. You need to have a good idea of why you're doing it and where you're going and what the point is. And I think it can be tricky, maybe, again, if you're sort of looking and saying, I want to learn to draw anatomy because I want to draw cool poses. So this is often what our outcome is like. We want to handle foreshortening, we want to do cool poses, and we want to have that feeling of energy and excitement and dynamics in the pose. And that's kind of why we're doing this. Now, the problem is that often when we're learning to do the basics, right, this is not what we're doing, because we're just trying to control things. So when we deal with control, it's really important to understand this stuff will help us eventually get to the point where we can draw cool poses. Again, I put that there because I think it's a goal that a lot of people are trying to fit, right? It's like how to draw these kind of like cool action dynamic poses. And often this is kind of the goal that we're heading towards, that we're going to sort of say we've succeeded or failed based on our ability to do this, to draw a cool pose, have the anatomy work, make like it's sort of in proportion, draw the muscles right, etc., etc. That's certainly what I felt, when I was sort of starting out drawing. Like my inability to draw cool poses and get all the foreshortening happening right really, really felt like I couldn't draw until I got that right. Now, all of that is really important. Drawing cool poses is key, but there are other considerations, and I think some of these other considerations can be better for figuring out how we actually solve these problems and get our intent right in the beginning. Now, apologies, my recording failed for a little bit, and so I've actually, I'm a little bit ahead of things here. But the fourth thing here that I think is just as important is the idea of being able to match exact acting or emotion. And the idea here is that being able to draw the dynamic poses is, I think, often the goal, but the thing that will often really serve you as a working artist over time is this fourth thing. It's being able to act through the character and use that as a way to understand how a character might move. And again, just being able to start to feel who that character is through your own set of emotions. This is also something, as I said, that will come in really handy if you draw comics. But more importantly, I think conceiving of your practice in this way, where we're always going at it from the perspective of who is this character? What are they thinking? How do I get that thinking and that feeling across through my drawing, is actually a much, much better way to practice. And the reason for that is intent is really, really key to the success of all your drawing, but especially your learning. it's really important to have the proper intent going into anything you do, because that is the main thing that will drive your expectation and your feeling of success or failure. The problem is with drawing cool poses is that there's so many different ways to make it work. And I think actually you can often find people who get quite good at drawing cool poses, but they sort of miss some of these basics, and they actually find it very tricky to kind of draw grounded characters who are just kind of standing on the ground doing basic things. And they find it difficult to push feeling and emotion and specific scenarios into the drawing and make that interesting. And I think it's often this thing that will set you apart and allow you to draw scenes and sort of everyday things in a really, really effective way. Now, what we need to do is consider how these things can be used as an exercise and what we can do there. So, as I said, just keep in mind the basics here. What you're trying to do through learning and looking at a simple set of exercises like this is just, how do I draw the figure? The second thing is, how do I kind of manipulate them a little bit? How do I control the three-dimensional space? How do I draw them so it's obvious that they're kind of doing something, but they still stay within proportion? Again, a lot of that is about basic drawing and just understanding how the mannequin works. The next thing is to think about the motion, the emotion, thinking about the weight of the balance. How are they sitting? How are they standing? How do we think about these things? And the next set of concepts that I think is really important is, how do we sort of translate this into functional art, where we're actually coming up with an idea and then making sure that our drawing can execute and, actually bring that idea to life. Because again, on this channel, I'm all about drawing stuff from imagination and bringing that stuff to life. What I will say, just as one little sort of thing to throw out there, is I feel like a lot of the time when we think about gesture or drawing little poses, there's a huge focus on this style of gesture, the flowy gesture, that really makes it feel as if the character is dancing or that there's motion. I don't come at it from this direction, and I think while it's obviously important to be able to do this, there's no difference between this and just drawing a character who is standing upright or straight. It's all about what the drawing needs. And I think it's easy to get sucked into doing a lot of these things because now my drawing feels like it has life, it has gesture, it has this kind of fluidity. But not all characters have that kind of fluidity. Not all characters dance. Not all characters float about like this with S-curves, right? Some people are awkward. Some people are upright. Some people are uptight. And as an actor who has to create many characters, you have to be able to embody the different physicalities of different people and feelings and emotions. And this is just one type. So it's really important to understand that this stuff is good because it's a progression from the first stage. Here we have static characters that feel lifeless. Here we have characters that have sort of life to them. They're moving, and we can feel that they move because we're paying attention to these concepts such as the pivots and where the weight is in relation to gravity, etc. This is vital because it starts to give you a taste for that concept of having the character move. But it doesn't end there. This is just one little step along the journey. And as with everything, it's important not to get sort of too sucked into this as an abstract exercise. The other thing that's important to consider, just as a small little addition, is when we think about drawing cool poses, often that's what we're seeing when we're looking at sort of marketing art or splash screen art, right? It's a lot of these kind of really cool, dynamic, exaggerated poses, right? Again, it's super important to be able to do that. But often when you're actually just sort of drawing comics or you've got a lot of sort of functional, practical work to do, we are dealing a lot more with subtlety. So even in character design, you only need to draw these sort of basic poses, but you need to try and imbue some character of the character that you're designing through that. So it's often about the subtlety of exactly how they sort of stand, exactly how they hold themselves. In a similar way, if you look at this sort of comic that I drew, the fantasy comic Ara, a lot of the time what I'm doing, again, because, I'm not, this is not a Western superhero comic, so it's not just people punching each other or In these sort of dynamic poses, a lot of it is just set as people who can't fly and can't, do these sort of superhero things. So often the poses and the camera angles are quite sort of standard, right? It's a little bit more sort of filmic. And in my experience, in many, many cases, this is the thing that I would do most of, is just trying to say, well, look, the character's just standing there. They're just sitting there. They're just doing something. How do I make it feel as if they're sort of having some emotion or some character as they do that? Anyway, that's enough of me repeating the same thing. Let's jump in and do some sketching. All right, here we go. So I've got this character that I have used, the Lion Warrior character. What we're going to do is, in this case, think about drawing a set number of poses. There's a variety of ways you can do this. It doesn't really matter. Again, I'm not really about rules, but I do think that setting a number or a time duration or some kind of constraint on yourself will really, really help to just sort of get into the flow and get into focused drawing. The key here is to really focus on what is the most important thing here, which is matching some form of action or figuring out what the character is trying to do. Now, obviously, you want to be able to control the basic proportion as much as possible. And if you're really struggling with that, I think it's a good idea to just do 20 poses of the character just standing in slightly different ways. So the key with a lot of drawing exercise is to understand that what we're trying to do as we do exercises is do a little. So only a little bit of this each day. Don't smash this out for 8 hours a day or 16 hours a day. We want to do a few of these exercises here and there so that we slowly build up our knowledge over time. The key is to increase and max out the rate of neurological adaptation. You can think of this as being similar to riding a bike. What you want to do is not just spend one day where you just sort of ride your bike until you fall over and start making mistakes. At some point, you basically are not learning more by doing more of the same thing, because a lot of neurological adaptation in this space is where we're actually educating the subconscious mind, not the conscious mind. And so the learning and adaptation happens when you sleep. That's when that sort of intellectual information that we've learned and the sort of practical stuff we remember actually enters into the subconscious, and then it becomes easier to do it the next day. So the goal with this is try a little bit of this, but do these exercises every now and then. The other thing is that you don't necessarily want to sort of just go, okay, I did one sort of standard pose here, and now it's time for me to sort of tackle these sort of huge action poses, right? You want to make sure that you're actually controlling and getting good at these poses and concepts as you go. So you want to ratchet up the level of complexity just a little bit at a time. So again, try a pose from the front. If you really want, try a pose from the back, try one from the side, and then just sort of say, oh, I'm just going to have them holding something, and just progress like little bit by little bit, sort of baby steps at a time. So I'm going to be trying some very divergent things, but remember that my general recommendation is just make it fun. I think one of the best ways you can make it fun is, progress slowly but steadily. That is the best way I think we can sort of put it, right? We want to go slow and steady, right? That's kind of what wins the race, or whatever, I forget. So again, here we're doing, mix of sort of skeleton and adding some sort of musculature. But this is what I'd recommend here. Right, again, it might have that leg up. So just adding and modifying a tiny bit by tiny bit. Just adding, let's try one little pose here, one little pose there. Let's try and make this a little bit different. Don't make things too complicated to the point where they become sort of painful or not fun. Again, the goal here is to maximize the fun you're having with this, and if you're, constantly pushing the barriers, constantly trying to, draw some foreshortened pose from a weird camera angle with crazy foreshortening, but you're having real trouble actually just drawing a basic 3/4 view, then just step it back, just do a little bit, make sure you're having fun, and just modify again with that narrative, right? Oh, the characters, like holding something. How would they hold it? Let's see if we can line this up. Let's see if we can get this, looking right. Let's see if we can get this looking as if it feels like the weight is correct. And once you've done that, you can again progress on to more and more complicated things as you go. What you'll find is, again, if you do this for sort of, right? If you do it for sort of 30 minutes a day or 60 minutes a day, you'll get good really quickly if you just kind of make it a habit. Now, there's an infinite number of ways you can actually do this exercise. You can say, okay, I'm just going to set myself 20 poses, and you're just going to sort of work on that for 30 minutes each day. And, just if you do 2 poses one day, 5 poses the next day, doesn't matter, right? The goal is to feel some level of achievement when you get to a certain point. And then one of the things you can maybe do is try and do as many, see if you can just up the rate. Maybe see, and if you get really good at doing 2 poses, so they're like 15 minutes each, or, you want to try them quicker or whatever. Again, you just have a goal, you have some structure. It doesn't have to be crazy, sort of tight or authoritarian. It's just to give you some feeling of like, I'm not just sort of sitting down and randomly sketching, right? I'm just not sort of having no goal. Again, what we want to do is kind of think about this. And then once you've done those 20 or that sort of set number, then you can kind of come back and step back a little bit and look at it and be like, look, what worked? What didn't work? What are some things I could look at? So just make sure you give yourself some structure. And a lot of this depends on your personality, right? A lot of people might like, hey, do 20 poses in 30 minutes each day. Do 20 poses in like 60 minutes each day. So that means you're doing basically like 3 minutes a pose, right? So they're more gestural. And that's totally fine. You can sort of play around with that. Again, you can just make sure that these are, very sort of gestural, quick sort of poses, right? Where you're, again, drawing the same sort of thing, maybe some different angles, right? Maybe the character is, again, this character has this kind of giant beard, but yeah, just kind of do some little gestural steps, right? Again, you can put some musculature on or not, depends. Totally up to you, right? Whatever feels comfortable. Now, again, that is just to give you an introduction to the basic idea of what I'm talking about, right? So we want to set ourselves some structure. I don't know whether I'll get through sort of 20 poses. I might make a second video that's kind of me, actually doing the exercise and not sort of talking about me doing the exercise. But what we'll talk about next is how we specifically do this thing where, again, we're trying to match some exact acting or emotion. But again, realize that that's quite a high-level task to do. It's a goal. But you can start with something very basic, like the thing I'm trying to do is have the character stand there and kind of feel really solid, right? Again, it's an action hero. You want them to feel really chunky and sort of as if they've got good balance, right? People often are warriors or fighters or martial artists, have good balance, right? They really feel grounded because that's such a part of what they do. You could also, pick a female character and just have them, feeling as if they are, standing in, an elegant way or whatever mix of stuff feels right to you, right? It's just all about what your fantasy is and what you're trying to achieve. Again, it can be sort of generic or you could be trying to hit stereotypes, whatever. Don't feel bad about not pushing any boundaries. That's what I would say. The trick is to get into the habit of doing this kind of stuff and make sure you're progressing at a rate that is sort of fun and lets you feel as if you're achieving something at this stage. But anyway, let's jump in and we'll talk specifically about matching some acting scenario. So this is where you get to role play and think very much about the specifics of who your character is and what types of things they're going to do. this is naturally a good way to think through the problem and also make sure that, you're not stepping way outside your comfort zone. So obviously, this is a warrior character, right? So one of the things they're going to be doing is kind of standing in, a semi sort of dynamic, aggressive pose. So you could kind of say that, right? They're kind of at the ready, or they could be sort of in an action pose or doing something like that. So in all of these cases, what we're mostly trying to do is sort of feel some sense of sort of aggression or sort of motion, right? And again, there's not always again, where you start and where you sort of finish and all those things is very specific to you, and I wouldn't get too sort of fussed about like, oh, always start here or always start there. It really depends on who you are and what you want to do, all those kind of things. But again, just think about the character. Again, need to get that sort of chunkiness right. So the more you can kind of try and feel the character or like feel where they would be sort of moving, you can also obviously look at reference for this. One of the things that's important to understand is, you can understand the physics of like how the character would be, sort of moving, or, what they sort of should be doing from an actual, combat experience point of view. The thing that is normally going to make your character feel as if they are sort of moving or has some sense of sort of gesture or whatever you want to call it is often just a feeling of some sort of set of lines or some sort of flow within the character, right? It's a feeling that there is acceleration and movement through the drawing, and that's often what those sort of cool poses and gestures are about. And again, we could do a variety of these sort of things. Obviously, right, the character, if we were to kind of add some musculature to this, all right, the character's gonna have some pretty chunky sort of arms there. So again, I'm with some of these, I'll add some of the extra stuff just so you can kind of see how that would kind of play out. And again, you can kind of just see his eyes there. Now again, not necessarily the most effective sort of pose because you can't see the face, but anyway, that's kind of what we got. And again, what's happening with the feet, not quite sure. But again, that's the idea of sort of gesture or posing. Ideally, you would sort of solve some of those other problems at the next stage. So the other thing you could kind of try to do is think about, how do we pose the character if they're, looking at things from a particular angle, right? So maybe we're looking down at the character and we're looking at the back of their head. Right. So this is where draw through. Right, form drawing. And perspective are your friends. So again, I'm sort of looking at them from above. Right, we got this little sort of arc there. Right, got some sort of shoulders, and we've got one sort of knee coming out there. Right, maybe the other knee is kind of right behind the character drawing through. So I'm also going to sort of visualize what's happening with the space underneath there. Right, again, we've probably got a shadow or something like that. We might have the character have them holding. Let's get rid of that. I think that arrow is throwing me off. Right, got that torso. Let's find some of those things again. Right, I want an arm to be there. Maybe we've got a sword kind of here. It's going down to the ground, and again we've got an arm coming out that way. Again, this arm could be, you know, wherever we sort of want it. Right, we could, you know, play around with that sort of thing. Again, foot there. Again, other foot here. Is this a good pose? I don't know. It's not really having much intent behind it. But again, your intent could just be to sort of explore some different perspectives. But I think often, and this is why I say this, is that often just thinking in sort of 3 dimensions or trying to push yourself, we kind of lose the thing that's going to draw characters in and really make sure that we don't get sort of stuck in a technical drawing trap. So the question is often like, what are we doing with these things? Am I just sort of randomly placing things around, and, you know, what am I doing? And this is where, again, having a story, right? Or maybe the character could be placing something somewhere, right? So this gives us some sort of purpose for them to sort of be sitting down, right? So maybe they are, again, let's have them do something like this. Right, so again, maybe they have some center that would sort of be in front. There's something they're kind of doing, something they're putting something in, etc. Again, this gives us some sort of goal, right? Like, what's the character doing? So I often find that, again, the more I have story, the more I have narrative, the better. Now, the fun thing about this is, sure, we can draw action poses all we want, and again, you can sort of think about how do I add foreshortening, right? How do I do this? How do I do that? Those are all really, really good things to try and play around with. I think that also another thing you can do is now this stuff will be quite tricky, so don't worry too much about that stuff. But we can also just think about, well, what are some more mundane things that a character like this might be doing? Again, the things that are sort of often really good to think about from character in general are things like kind of how do people eat, how do people sleep, how do people sit, right? Sort of covered the sort of sitting one a little bit more. What are sort of, like kind of tasks? And maybe what are some tasks that might be a little bit sort of hard to, think of, right? So again, one of the things we could do is maybe the character is kind of sitting down because they're a fantasy character in a Dungeons and Dragons-esque world. Maybe they're trying to start a fire. So again, in this case, we're going to need to think a little bit about our sort of general structural drawing. And actually, let's draw that over here. So let's think about, again, what I would sort of try and do to begin with is try and block out some of that three-dimensional space. Now, this is where, again, really, really thinking about functionality and not just kind of drawing random action poses is super useful as a working artist. This is one of the harder sort of things to do, but thinking about proportion and how we sort of control that is key to just being able to draw whatever you want. Again, you have an idea in your head and you can sort of draw it. You don't sort of always have to focus on making things look cool and dynamic. So, again, maybe there's a little sort of fire here or something like that. Again, you don't have to draw the fire. I'm just sort of drawing it for, so you can sort of see. If I was doing it myself, I'd imagine all that stuff and just focus on the basics. So again, we know that maybe one knee is going to sort of be on the ground, right? If I think about how I'm going to kneel down. Now, if you're sitting here going like, oh, how How do you kneel down to light a fire? Get down and try and do it. Just literally think about it and put your body into the scenario where you'd actually do it and see what it feels like and do it yourself. That is the easiest, funnest way to do this. And that's what I often recommend to students. You know, they'll sort of show me a pose of like, again, a fantasy character with a staff or something like that. And I'm like, can you kind of feel like if you were in this angle, that if you're in this pose, that you would feel uncomfortable? So that's often one of the things that's there is like, if you see a pose that is sort of, you know, doesn't quite feel right, then just try and get in that pose and then see like, do you feel balanced? Do you feel at ease? Do you feel tense? Are you feeling the right emotion as you get into it? In a similar way, if you're trying to kind of figure out, again, how does a pose like this go, then again, get in it. Get out the mirror, get out the broomstick, you know, role play, do that stuff. No one will ever know. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to do it on a YouTube channel and sort of show that. That would just be embarrassing. But I certainly do it when I'm you know, just thinking about it. And often, you know, as well, you know, you're thinking about how does a hand go, you know, how does an arm go? You know, you'll often sort of move around or kind of think about like, oh, how does that go? If I'm holding this thing over here, you know, what does that do to my shoulder or etc. So a lot of what we're doing is, again, role play, right? We're living and breathing it. Right. So again, the character's kind of kneeling down. I think, again, this needs to be bigger. We could probably have that head even further down, right? And then probably a good idea again to get rid of some of this just so it makes it easier to draw. And I will sharpen the pencil if I can find the pencil sharpener. Yeah, and again, you could try and do character lighting a fire, you know, 5 times, 10 times, just exactly how do they do it. Go look at some reference, you know, play around with that. Again, if you want. But I think again that the advantage of this is it really kind of helps us to focus on just making it work as opposed to getting worried if things kind of aren't working too much. I know that sounds weird, but again, functionality is often a really good panacea to kind of neurosis. Right? So again, the character is kind of kneeling down. They've got one leg there. Here we've got the hip. Right? Again, this character, I always need to remember, like, this character is kind of huge. Right? That's part of the... Right, got the beard there. And we just sort of connect up some of these things. So you don't really need to have all of this anatomy and all of this stuff solved in order to kind of know, like, yep, you know, I've kind of solved this. I've solved this problem, right? I've kind of got to a point where this is going to work, right? Again, a lot of that is experience, but to a certain degree, again, if we've got this kind of muscles here, this thing there, again, this is just going to be a quick sort of gestural sketch, and we're going to start to feel it like, yep, okay, we sort of posed it in the right spot. We've got shoulders down, heads here, right? We're going to be able to sort of read that. Again, I'll just sort of erase it to make it a bit clearer, because again, you tend to get a bit sketchy when you're actually sort of doing this. But again, I feel like this is a really important point. When you're just focusing on draw cool pose, if you kind of get messy with it, right? If your sort of craft starts to fail you to a certain degree, you can sort of feel down on yourself. Whereas often what you'll find is when you're actually working, when I'm actually working and doing things, if there's a purpose to it, even if I kind of end up with like a bit of a crappy drawing, right? Because it gets reworked and, you know, reused, and it's like, that's kind of pretty nasty. if I'm kind of solving the problem, there's a certain feeling of success, right? There's a certain feeling of like, yes, look, this is messy, but I kind of solved the problem I was trying to solve. I had some functionality to the art. And even though, again, it's not quite finished, it's not quite sort of perfect, right? I've done the thing that I needed to do, and therefore a bad drawing can become really useful. And this is, again, one of those things that I think is so important to understand for people who are beginning and starting out, is that often when you're actually kind of working, you kind of have often, drawings that aren't the best, right? That aren't that good, but they have functionality to them. And I think it's often this kind of functionality that breeds a lot of really interesting lines and that sort of feeling of solidarity. When you're sort of starting out, it's often sort of hard because people are often trying to get that level of sort of fluidity and simplicity, and like they're trying to achieve a certain thing. But if you're not heading towards the functional purpose of doing it, you're never going to get there. You're kind of focusing on the line, whereas what I'm thinking about is character. That's all I'm thinking about. The lines can sort of, get lost, right? They can go pound sand. I don't care about the lines or the quality. All I care about is like, can I get this thing kind of looking right so that I can, take it further, build something extra. Now, another really sort of good exercise to do is to sort of just start practicing doing these sort of same poses from different angles, right? This is another way for you to kind of understand the same basic idea and give yourself a little task. So here again, I'm going to use the same kind of thing, but in this case, right, we're sort of looking at it from the side. Now again, we'll do this one as much more of like, with some of these I'm building them out a little bit more just to kind of progress it. But again, often what you're going to be doing is just a little bit more like this, right? Got one character sort of there, and again, maybe like kind of working with some sort of flint and got some sort of fire stuff here, right? We've got like a bunch of sort of wood prepared here on like a little makeshift fire, right? And that's kind of what we got. So just practice those gestures, right? Does that feel right? Does that feel like the character's in proportion? Does it feel like they're doing the right thing? Again, what's something else you could be doing? Well, let's do the same thing, but let's sort of make the character sit on something as opposed to kneel. Again, to just show the sort of concepts of sort of minor progression. Right, so in this case, what I'm going to do is, again, let's sort of have a sort of a fire here, right? But instead, the character is kind of sitting on a little sort of log or stone or something like that. So again, we're going to have the base or the pelvis of the character, and because this character is sort of so big, right? This could be almost sort of comedic, right? They're sort of having to really sort of crouch down. And this is where, again, you can start to kind of play with this thing and kind of think about, well, like, if the character is so chunky, right, you have to sort of lean down, right? It's almost going to be a little bit kind of awkward, right? Like how you actually sort of do that, right? So again, we might have character kind of here, right? So we got some shoulders somewhere there, beard sort of down here, right? Center line, and maybe here again we're going to sort of have the arm, we're going to have a hand, right? Shoulder, right? And maybe this one is kind of, again, sort of doing something down here. And again, just experiment, keep playing around. Right, again, not sure whether that gesturally is kind of working. That's a little bit sort of hard to see. Again, if you're doing it, you don't need to erase it. You just like, as long as you sort of, as soon as you get the pose and you feel like, yeah, look, this is sort of, this is sort of working, then you're done. You've succeeded. Right, but again, maybe we could have something like this, right? He's got sort of hands there. He's doing something, cutting something up, right? Just doing some sort of basic stuff. But it's often these little sort of poses and things that will, really help to bring your sort of art to life. And this stuff is often, honestly, it's the kind of thing that, people find hard. It is quite challenging to, come up with little sort of boring poses and sort of make them interesting. Again, maybe sort of cutting up some stuff for fire, right? But in this case, again, he's got to sit down, right? So he's kind of got, if we sort of think about, again, we're doing it from the front, which is, again, practical foreshortening, right? Often people are foreshortening is like, it's the fist coming at you. Often foreshortening is just the concept of having to draw through. It's the idea of sort of having to draw some sort of shoulders and stuff in front of chest, right? The head in front of the body, etc., and just sort of dealing with a mass of limbs and other bits and pieces that sort of kind of get in the way of each other. But again, that's a start. And this is why, again, people do so many sketches. This is another one of those things when I used to sort of look at art books and I'd see these kind of sort of sketches, and there would often be a looseness to them, like a functionality to them. And then when I try and replicate that, I'm just trying to replicate the functionality of it. And it just doesn't work. Because the reason is I'm like, right, okay, I've sort of got that, and we're either going to sort of take that further, or what we're going to do is, start again. It's like the sketch serves a purpose. These thumbnails and things serve a purpose, and, that's it. But again, so what's happening with this guy is he's kind of, right, he's sort of got legs, right, that are kind of coming out to the side, basically, or like coming to the side like this, and he's sort of almost sitting sort of cross-legged, and, right, he's kind of got his head here, giant sort of chest here, and he's basically sort of got his arm kind of there. So again, think about how you draw these poses from different angles, etc. Yeah, I think I need to redo my pencil sharpening. So hopefully that gives you some idea. Again, I'll do another video in the future where basically I just focus on doing the exercise as opposed to sort of showing different ways to do it. But I think this is a really good way to think about how to practice this. So in the beginning, again, it's really good to focus on those basics. As I said, look at the Loomis book, look at those standard sheets, just get control of a mannequin, any mannequin. It doesn't really matter. The second thing is, again, often a lot of sort of general advice on how to pose the figure. We'll talk about motion and emotion. And that's where, again, just sort of getting the feeling of the character doing something, right? So, again, if we sort of think about, the character is feeling like they're sort of moving through kind of, space, or, again, they have some sort of flow to them, right? I think that's, sort of super useful. Just sort of get a feeling for like, okay, if I sort of move these characters around, again, if you do focus on getting some sort of S curves and things like that, that will be useful, because again, we're not static, and that's key. And just understand that often the route to kind of cool poses is sort of doing a lot of these things first and then really thinking about this. Because again, I think one of the things that we often miss is that even though people are in cool poses, they often have their own emotion and character to the way that they do that. So keep those in mind. And I think a really good exercise, as I said, is draw 20, or give yourself a time limit. You could say, hey, I'm going to do, a few of these every day. I'm going to set the timer for like 20 minutes. Just sort of practice this, just keep going through. And as I said, get into the minutiae of what you like. You probably don't like drawing white lion warriors, doing mundane tasks like this. Whatever is interesting for you. Again, for me, this is sort of where I go. The other thing you could be is like, oh, people are, sitting around in a fantasy tavern. They're playing cards. They're drinking beer. Someone's like ordering a drink. Someone's talking to someone. Someone's sitting down and they're talking to someone who's standing up, right? Someone's leaning against a post. Someone is interacting with the world in some way. They're picking flowers. They're carrying a heavy object. They're carrying an awkward object. Whatever it is, you just iterate and think about, and just think about like kind of how the character is acting. What would they be doing? If you were big, how would you kind of maneuver yourself? If you're really small and light, how would that feel? How would you maneuver yourself there? Get into the feeling of who the actual character is, who that character means to you, and how you can kind of draw them in different angles. The functionality of thinking it that way, in my experience and in my opinion, is one of the best ways for you to actually build functional drawing knowledge and functional drawing skills when it comes to posing the character. And once you've done that, you'll be much better at drawing cool poses. Anyway, that's all I've got for this one. Let me know what you think in the comments, whether you got any ideas for future videos around similar things, or you want any of these concepts explained in more detail. I'd be more than happy to do that. But other than that, that's all I got for this one. We'll catch you around. Happy drawing.